to introduce to you our speaker for
Thank you, Amina, and thank you everyone for being here this evening, taking time out on a Friday evening, no less, to be with us. So I really look forward to having a conversation with you, and that's really what I'd like to do, is speak for a while, and you'll help me keep track of time and make sure that we have enough time to engage in a conversation, because I learn a lot also from the questions that get asked. And I understand that a number of you are students. How many are? Oh, wow. Okay, most of you are students. And I'm assuming you're students of international affairs, and many of you perhaps with a focus on the Middle East. How many of you studied the Middle East? Okay, so only a couple. So I spoke with Dr. Agrawal about whether I should focus my talk on the book and on Tunisia, or really talk about sort of what else is happening in the region. And I think I'm going to try to do both. Tunisia is a very interesting case study of an exceptional democracy in the Arab world, and understanding it is very helpful to also understanding what else is going on in the Arab world. So I'll start with that, and then we can discuss a little bit some of the shifting dynamics that are taking place in the region. Iran, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Syria, Libya, and so on. Now, I started this research that resulted in this book because I was really very invested in trying to understand what happened to the region that I come from. Okay, I was born in Jordan, and when we started setting up the global centers, I was in Jordan for a while, helping set up some educational institutions. And during that period, I came to realize that that world that I had grown up in was very, very different from the world that I was living in at that time, in the late 2000s, just before the Arab Spring. I found that world that I grew up in the 1960s and 1970s, in Cairo, in Beirut, in Amman, had tremendous potential. And that potential seems to have gone by the wayside. The region that I grew up in was somewhat modern, progressive, secular to a large extent, inclusive and pluralistic. I was born into a Muslim family. I went to a Christian school, and that was very typical, if you will. And I found myself, coming back to a region that had become incredibly polarized, where religious minorities were persecuted, where education systems and curricula and content of education systems have become really exclusionary. People ask, sort of the Arab Spring, couldn't it have been predicted? Of course, in hindsight, we can say, yes, it should have been predicted. None of us predicted it, but many of us knew that something was wrong. I mean, something was not going to, it was not sustainable, it was not a tenable situation. And so when it exploded in 2010, 2011, it didn't come as a total surprise. Now, how it has developed and evolved since that time is also, to a very large extent, a reflection of the deeply seeded problems that I was beginning to be aware of and to write about and to research in the year 2009, 2010, 2011. And then with the Arab Spring and with its outbreak, and it started in Tunisia with the self-immolation of a fruit street vendor, and led to the ouster of Ben Ali, the authoritarian ruler, and has led over the past few years to a democratic transition, a constitutional writing process that took 3 years. It was widely publicly debated, adopted in 2014, a secular constitution, a first of its kind in the Arab world, the only constitution, by the way, that protects freedom of conscience. So Tunisia is the only Arab country where it is not a crime that's punishable by law to be an atheist, for example. Okay, it's the only country. So the adoption of the constitution, parliamentary elections, presidential elections, more recently last year, municipal elections, lots of issues nonetheless. Okay, political stability has not been fully achieved, economic problems, plagued the country, but nonetheless, what we saw over the past 8-9 years has been sort of a transition into democracy that has been, for the most part, very successful. At the same time, we saw what happened in Egypt, right? Similar results at the beginning. The ouster of Mubarak, who had been president for 31 years. Then we had elections. Those elections brought in the Islamist party, the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood overplayed its hand, if you will, during the 12 months that it was in power. And that resulted in July of 2013 in a military coup. And Egypt today is in the throes of a military dictatorship that is far worse than the one that the Mubarak regime had led. And just last week, President Sisi saw to it that Parliament ratified an amendment to the Constitution that basically allows him to be president for life. And this will be presented to the people of Egypt for a referendum, and I can tell you right now what the outcome of that referendum vote are going to be. 99% in favor, okay? And you can come back and question me if that's not the result that is going to be announced by the regime. So you had that in Egypt. In Syria, we had a civil war that has resulted in more than 500,000 deaths, about 5.6 million people who are refugees, another 6 million who have been internally displaced. That's a country of a total population of 20 million. So half the population has been displaced, either internally or externally. It is estimated that it will cost somewhere like $250 billion to rebuild the state. You have Yemen, right, where there continues to be a civil war between the Houthis, who control the northwest of the country, and then the followers of President Hadi, who is in exile in Saudi Arabia. The Houthis are supported by Iran. The oppositionists are supported by Saudi Arabia and by the United Arab Emirates. And the outcome of that civil war has been so far tens of thousands who are dead, many more who are injured, half the population depending on international aid to survive, a cholera epidemic that is unprecedented in modern times. In Libya, you had the coalition forces go in and had get rid of Muammar Gaddafi, who had been in power since 1970. And now what do we have? We have a country that is split between a government in the west, in Tripoli, that is recognized by the United Nations, and a government that is self-declared in Tobruk in the east of the country. And that one in the east of the country, which is not considered legitimate by international bodies, is supported by Egypt and by the United Arab Emirates and is being funded by them. And so you have a diminishing war to a large extent in Libya, but you have two governments that are competing for one another, with one another for control, and then you have countries like France and Italy that are competing for influence in Libya, because Libya to them is incredibly important because of oil and gas and because of the migrant issue, especially as it affects Italy. So you have Syria, you have Yemen, you have Libya, you have regional powers that are competing and engaged in proxy wars, whether it is by Iran on the one hand and a coalition of the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia and sometimes Egypt on the other. You have Egypt, where we had hope for democracy, and that hope quickly fizzled. And you had other countries that were tangential, if you will, Arab Spring countries, like Jordan and Morocco, where some reforms were put in place, but not a whole lot has changed in those countries. And then you have Tunisia. And then you have Tunisia, which is really the only country that has emerged out of the Arab Spring, largely unscathed, largely peacefully, and where there's a democratic transition that has been taking place. Let's not forget also Iraq, which has been dealing with and suffering from sectarian tensions between the Sunnis and the Shias. Saddam Hussein represented the Sunni minority that ruled over a country of Shia majority, a country that's not all Arab, because you have a good number of Kurds who are non-Arab, but Sunni Muslims living in the north. And since 2003 and the invasion of Iraq, Shia came into power, and now the Sunnis feel marginalized, and those tensions have prevented a political stability from coming in, especially that the Shia are supported by Iran next door. You have had the costs also, of course, that are associated with rebuilding Iraq, an economy that's shattered, that depends a lot on trade with Iran, but Iraq is also subjected to obey the sanctions, the US sanctions that have been imposed on Iran. So you've got all of that mess going on inside Iraq, and then Lebanon, which only 2 weeks ago formed a government. For 9 months, the country went on without a government. So Lebanon, by the way, is a democracy in that there are elections, and democracy, of course, is not only electoral democracy. Democracy is freedom of expression, freedom of the press, freedom of conscience, freedom of religion. But Lebanon is a dysfunctional democracy, and it's a democracy that's been really plagued with foreign intervention and with sectarianism, right? Because Lebanon is a country which is roughly 1/3 Sunni, 1/3 Shia, and 1/3 Christian. And Christians, you have the Maronites and you have the Greek Orthodox. And I always say Lebanon's biggest problem is that it's in the wrong neighborhoods. It shares borders with Israel, it shares borders with Syria. Iran has ambitions within Lebanon to extend its power in the region, and thus Hezbollah and the strength of Hezbollah. And you have Saudi Arabia also, which exerts a lot of influence within Lebanon. If we have time, we can go back and discuss the Lebanon case in more detail. So you've got the region that's a mess, okay? And I don't know of any period in time when it was not a mess. Let's maybe do a little bit of history lesson on the region. I'll get into Egypt, but it's don't forget that most of the region was part of the Ottoman Empire, right? And as the Ottoman Empire started to wane in the middle of the 19th century, and European powers became stronger, European powers were interested in weakening the Ottoman Empire in its domains so that they can replace the Ottoman Empire. And first, of course, they focused on European domains of the Ottoman Empire. Slowly but surely, they started investing in replacing the Ottoman Empire in its other domains. So in Egypt, for example, Britain and France became heavily involved in funding major projects in Egypt, including the Suez Canal, and resulting in Egypt declaring bankruptcy in 1876, and 6 years later, 1882, comes under British rule. Okay, so that's not an entirely unfamiliar scenario in this part of the world, right? First economic colonization, then followed by political and military colonization. And that is true in a number of countries in the region. So you have the British and the French dividing up spheres of influence after the First World War. Sykes-Picot, 1916, was an agreement between France and England that carved up the Middle East and created countries that hitherto had not existed. Okay, so you had Greater Syria, Bilad al-Sham, the Levant, which includes what would today be Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Israel, right? None of the countries that exist there existed before 1916, okay? Carved up, so Jordan becomes a country, Syria becomes a country, Lebanon, you had Mount Lebanon as a country since 1860, or as a state under Ottoman rule. It is expanded and it becomes the modern state of Lebanon, and of course the British mandate of Palestine as a future home for the Jewish people. Similarly, Iraq is carved up. Until that point, and for thousands of years, we knew Mesopotamia, but there was no such thing as Iraq. Saudi Arabia was founded in 1932, and after many decades of the British financially bankrolling two competing tribes, Rashid and Al Saud, decided to throw the lot behind Al Saud. Al Saud's nemesis was the Hashemites, who ruled over Western Saudi Arabia, Mecca and Medina in particular. So in a deal with the Sharif of Mecca, Sharif Hussein of Mecca. They got him out of Saudi, of the Al Saud herd. He played a role in the Great Arab Revolt in driving the Ottomans out. And as his reward, one of his sons, Abdullah, was given the newly created country, Jordan, which was then Transjordan. His other son, Faisal, was given the new country, Syria, but the Syrians rejected him, and the French rejected him because they wanted control. So they said, what do we do with him? He's in Damascus. Somebody came up with a brilliant idea that said, well, let's take him to Baghdad, because we're creating this new country, Iraq, and he can rule over Iraq. And that's really, I mean, as simplistic as it sounds, that's what happened. And what we're seeing today, you know, and then at the end of the British and the French mandates, after the Second World War, you had in most of the region puppet regimes that were put in place in the form of monarchies. You had movements, republicanists, who really tried very hard to create independent republics in places like Syria and Iraq. But then over a period of 2 decades, in the 1950s and 1960s, you had many coups and counter-coups that ended up installing the Assad regime in Syria and the Saddam Hussein regime in Iraq in 1970 and 1968, respectively, and those were the authoritarian regimes that, in the case of Iraq, continued to rule until 2003, and in the case of Syria, continued to rule until today, right? So you had an experiment for a couple of decades where there were attempts at creating independence, creating republicanism, creating democracy, but also those were driven by pan-Arab aspirations. So the Baathists of later Syria and Iraq had a vision for an Arab nation. Now, in Egypt, which got rid of British rule in the 1920s, the British installed an Albanian-born monarchy. In 1952, that monarchy was overthrown through what is called the Free Officers' Coup, when Jamal Abdel Nasser and a few of his compatriots drove out King Farouk. And for the first time in Egypt's history, okay, since the pharaohs, it was ruled by a local regime since 1952. That regime was military. Until today, it is military. So since 1952, in the last 67 years, Egypt was ruled by a non-military person for only a period of 1 year, when the Muslim Brotherhood was in charge between mid-2012 until mid-2013. Jamal Abdel Nasser had also pan-Arab aspirations, okay? And there was a brief marriage between Egypt and Syria, the United Arab Republic, between 1958 and 1961. That failed. The humiliating defeat in the Arab-Israeli War of 1967 brought to an end that notion of Arab nationalism. So let me stop here and just emphasize or recap a couple of important points. That a region that has been very artificially constructed with British, largely British, but British and French designs for it, that set it on a course that has been poisonous, to say the least. And what we're seeing now is the coming apart of that order that was put in place about 100 years ago without any regard to race, ethnicity, religion, or anything like that. Okay, it was very, very arbitrarily designed. The other problem with it was, of course, that as a result, with these states that were looking for nations, okay, so states or countries that became states, but really have not even till today developed as nations, they looked for a national identity. And to try to come up with a national identity, they built up militaries as a source of national pride, and they became very exclusionary in their rhetoric. So take a place like Iraq. Okay, you have a Sunni minority that came into power by force over a Shia majority. Shiism was basically extant from the Iraqi vocabulary. So So textbooks only talk about Sunni Islamic history and Sunni Islamic theology. Okay? Bahrain, same thing, that small island country, Sunni minority ruling over a Shia majority. Okay? The leaders of these countries have to rely, and here I'm making a general statement, so forgive me, because the nuances, of course, exist from country to country. But they pinned their building a national identity and the sense of belonging around myths that they created, okay, about the greatness of the regimes. Muammar Gaddafi is a classic example of that. The Ba'ath of Saddam Hussein and of Hafiz al-Assad are other good examples of that. And on building armies as a source of national pride, and oftentimes by pinning their nationalism on Islam and on religion. Okay? Now, it was not intended necessarily to be at the exclusion of other minorities, but how could it not become at the exclusion of other minorities when it becomes deeply rooted in the psyche of the nation? So even secular leaders, like Ibn Hussein of Jordan, had to give in to Islamism because he had with it a common thread, and that common thread was obedience, and not questioning of either the regime or religion. And the religionists and the Islamists in particular served a very important role in ensuring that that happens. Okay, so that's the picture sort of that brings us to where we are now to a very large extent, with a couple of exceptions. So if you look at the history of North Africa and the Middle East, and you think about the countries that were created overnight, and the pan-Arab national fantasy, and I say fantasy because when you think about it, what those countries from Morocco all the way to Iraq, from northern Syria, Aleppo, all the way down to Yemen, what do they have in common? Their histories, there is some intersection in their histories, but they don't necessarily have a shared history. Certainly not North Africa with the Gulf states of the region. Okay? What do they have in common? Religion. But Islam is not exclusive to that area. Actually, Arabs account for only 20% of the world's Muslims. So it's not like these countries, 22 countries of the Arab League of Nations, constitute Islam, and thus, that's a common factor. Okay? Language, yes, to a large extent. The language of the Quran, the language of Islam, is common among those countries. But even language changes as you move east and you move west, sort of, from the center. And when you get to Morocco, you cannot, if you are a Levantine Arab, really communicate in the Arabic language. And Algeria has its own language, which is a melange of Arabic, Berber, okay, and French. And when the Arabic language spread through the region, with the spread of Islam in the 7th century, what the conquering Arab Muslims found were Berbers in North Africa, Egyptians in Egypt, okay, ancient Egyptians. I mean, Egyptians referred to Arabs until 1952 and the Free Officers School as Bedouins of the Sinai Peninsula or the Arabs of the Gulf states. Okay? They did not think of themselves as Arab. And they encountered Babylonians and Assyrians and Philistines and so on in the Levant and Mesopotamia. So the whole notion of unity among those nations around a language that is really not that uniform across the region was, to a very large extent, a fantasy that I think has failed. And we see many aspects of that today. I like to think of the region as sort of consisting of at least 3 distinct regions. North Africa, which is very close to Europe, which has a Berber history, the Levant and Mesopotamia, and then the Arabian Gulf countries, okay, the Saudi Arabia, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, and so on. Now, the only 2 exceptions to the rule in terms of having had a history and geographical legitimacy are Egypt and, believe it or not, Tunisia. This very, very small country. So Egypt, since pharaonic times, has basically maintained the same kind of geography and the same kind of borders. They shifted in the 19th century. You know, at one point, Egypt included Sudan, at another point, it did not include Sudan. Tunisia, since its founding, since the founding of Carthage in the year 814 before Common Era, when Phoenicians arrived from Lebanon and settled in what was to become Carthage, from that time, and then, you know, of course, Carthage became a formidable force in the Mediterranean in terms of its maritime, military, you know, just strength, trade with Europe, competed with the Roman Empire. And we all know about the Punic Wars, the 3 wars. And they're called Punic Wars because Punic means Carthaginian in Latin. And the history of it was written, of course, by the victor, who were the Romans. Ended up with the destruction of Carthage. And then it was rebuilt by Augustus in the 1st century BCE. So it competed with the Roman Empire, and then Carthage became the capital of the province of Africa. The province of Africa under the Roman Empire. Okay, so it was called the province of Africa by the Romans, and Tunisians like to think that they owned the name of the continent. Africa was first Tunisia. Now, if you look at the borders of the province of Africa and you compare them to the borders of Tunisia today, they almost match. They almost match. So there was that territorial, geographic legitimacy that goes back thousands of years. So Tunisia went, through the Carthaginian days and then the Roman days for the first few centuries. And then the Byzantines, the Vandals before that, and then the Arab Muslims in the 7th century. So when the Arab Muslims arrived, there already had been a long history that was very diverse. You know, that was Christian, and that was African, and that was Berber, and that was European to a very large extent. And when the Ottoman Empire sort of arrived in North Africa, the local leaders of that province of Tunisia were able to negotiate in the early 18th century a semi-autonomous, but really largely autonomous rule under the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans were not vastly interested in North Africa, they were not that interested in Tunisia, they gave that. So Tunisia then developed through its local political leadership, and in the 19th century became very important to Europe because of its proximity to Europe. So you had economic migrants who came from Italy, who came from France, you had British influence over there as well, and you had local political and intellectual leadership that resulted in a number of things that were unprecedented in the rest of the region. So for example, in 1846, Tunisia, the Tunisian Bey, the ruler, Ahmed Bey, emancipates all slaves. Tunis, the capital of Tunisia, was a very important trade market for slaves, sub-Saharan slaves who were sold to owners who were European or Ottomans. In 1846, you had abolitionism in Tunisia, 2 years before France, 19 years before the United States. I'll digress for a second. In 1863, the local US Consul General, Amos Perry, writes the then Bey, Sadat Bey, asking him about the merits of abolitionism. So he writes him on behalf of Abraham Lincoln, wanting to know about the merits of abolitionism. The letter that is written back is written by Hussein Basha, who was the secretary of the Bey and the mayor of Tunis. It's a fascinating letter. Because in 1846, when slavery was abolished, to get the ulama of Islam behind it, the argument was made from within Islam that even though the Quran and the Prophet allowed for the ownership of slaves, the conditions that it had put forth for how those slaves must be treated are humanly impossible to meet. Those conditions are humanly impossible to meet. So, if I am the person in authority that allow you, my fellow countryman who's Muslim, to own slaves, I am depriving you of access to heaven in the hereafter. Because I know that you cannot meet those conditions. And that was what was... Now, Hussein Pasha knew that that kind of argument was not be irrelevant to Abraham Lincoln, right? You know, that's not... So what he did instead, he wrote him a treatise on the economics of labor and the difference between paid labor and unpaid labor. And he borrowed from the work of Ibn Khaldun, who was a great Tunisian philosopher and economist of the late 14th, early 15th century. In 1861, Tunisia adopted a constitution, the first in an Arab or Muslim country. 15 years before we had the first Ottoman constitution of 1876. In 1857, Tunisia adopted a security covenant that gave the non-Muslim subjects living in Tunisia equal rights to their Muslim counterparts who were Tunisian. And it was really meant to protect the rights of the Christian and Jewish subjects living in Tunisia at the time. And there were a number of other developments in the 19th century that saw the establishment of the first secular education institution in 1875, Slavic College, when the French and the English, of course, brought Tunisia to bankruptcy in 1869, similar to what they did in other places. In 1882, it became a protectorate of the French. But under the French, it continued to reform. It continued to reform in the fields of education and in the field of women's rights. That in the period during the French protectorate, between 1882 and 1956, a number of important developments took place. One is that Zaytuna Mosque, which was, and still is, a major place, not as much as it used to be, major place of scholarship, because as you know, a mosque was not only a mosque and a place for prayer, but it was also a school, and it was a place where theologians and philosophers and writers, converged and had a library and so on. Zaytuna Mosque was built in the late 7th century. It is 250 years older than the famous Al-Azhar Mosque of Cairo. The reforms that took place to try to advance women's rights and to create a more moderate role for religion in society happened within Zaytuna and outside of Zaytuna. So during that period of 60, 70 years, there were tensions within Zaytuna between the reformers and the traditionalists. And there were times when the leaders, the political/intellectual leaders, such as Khairuddin al-Tunisi, who established the first secular educational institution, and he was prime minister. He set that up because he did not feel satisfied with how far he could push his reforms at modernizing Zaytuna and its teaching curriculum. So he set up a parallel system, but he and his successors continued to work on reform within Zaytuna. That reform finally took shape in the 1940s. It took a very long time. But in the meantime, you had Zaytuna produce some of the most important and effective transformational sort of works. So in 1930, Tahir Haddad, a Zaytuna scholar, a alim, within Zaytuna, wrote a book, Imra'atuna fi Sharia wal Mujtama, Our Women in Sharia and Society, in which he advocated for the emancipation of women. He argued from within Islam for the abolition of polygamy, which was, of course, a common practice among Muslims. And he even argued for abortion under certain circumstances, and argued for not wearing the niqab for women and fleeing women. Now, at the time, there were his opponents, he had his detractors, and one person, Sheikh Ibrad, who later it was found out that he never actually read Tahir Haddad's book, declared him a heretic, and he was deprived of his Zaytuna credentials. 1956, Tunisia becomes a republic, okay, and gets its independence from the French. Habib Bourguiba, the country's first president, who was a leader of the nationalist movement for independence, his first act, before he even is named as president, but when he was sort of in charge under the Bey before the dissolution of the Ottoman rule in 1957, adopts a personal status code that basically takes that 1930 work and codifies it into law. So in 1956, Tunisian women become freer than they are today in 2019 in any Arab country. Tunisia is the only Arab country where polygamy is outlawed, and it's been outlawed since 1956. Okay, and that's just one example of how Tunisia stands out as an anomaly relative to the rest of the Arab world. Bourguiba also insists on secular education, on a bilingual education system, and is very distrustful of armies and militaries. Okay, so he did not buy into the pan-Arabism of Jamal Abdel Nasser, and that was emanating in Syria and Iraq with that. So now, we go back to the 1950s, remember what was going on in Egypt, in Syria, Iraq, elsewhere. Bourguiba decides that there is no such thing as an Arab nation. I'm not going to throw my lot with that and align myself with the Soviet Union, as those countries did in the Cold War. He aligns himself with the United States, but decides to follow a foreign policy that is not interventionist and does not feel the need to build a military and does not share a border with Israel. Okay, he's far from the center of gravity of tension in the region. He spends his money on education and on healthcare. The portion of the state budget that is dedicated to education rises to become 1/3 in 1973. By comparison, in 1974, the equivalent of 56% of Egypt's GDP was spent on the military. Okay. So in Egypt, you had a very strong army, you had leadership that came from the army, that was rooted in the 19th century. Muhammad Ali Pasha, who built a huge army in the early 19th century, drove that army to the gates of Constantinople, was going to unseat the Ottoman Empire until the French and the British pushed him back, and the Italians. And why did they push him back? Not to save the Ottoman Empire. They wanted to save it for themselves, to unseat and to conquer later on, which they did. And that tradition of a large army continued and continues in Egypt. So when you had Mubarak fall, the only two options that were left were the Muslim Brotherhood, which had been organized, which was born in Egypt in 1929, was waiting for a moment to take on power, or the military, which is hegemonic, which controls more than 50% of the economy of Egypt, and has always been very political, and as I said, has produced every president except for Morsi, who ruled for 1 year. By contrast, in Tunisia, you had a small army, but what you had instead is a very strong labor union. A very strong labor union that started in the 1920s, became organized as a union federation in 1946, gets the sanction of the Zaytuna Mosque. So again, and I think this is one of the very important points of comparison, is that Zaytuna was part of the reform. Things were done around it, but with it. Whereas in Egypt, Al-Azhar was working against the reformers of Egypt, the rulers of Egypt, Muhammad Ali Pasha, Khalid Ismail after him, and then the Wafd party did not trust Al-Azhar, and so you had those two competing powers. In Tunisia, when the Union Federation was formed in 1946, the head of Zaytuna Mosque, Sheikh Fadl bin Ashur at the time, presided over the Congress that resulted in the Union Federation and accepted the role of honorary chairman of the Union. So from the beginning, it had Islamic credentials associated with it. And its leader, Farhat Hashid, became a national voice for independence. He was deemed by the French as so dangerous that in 1952, he was assassinated by a French colonial group. Immediately, overnight, UGTT, the Union Générale Tunisienne de Travail, becomes inseparable in the Tunisian psyche from the nationalist movement for independence and has tremendous grassroots support within the country. So when Bourguiba, who at the beginning was very progressive, was very accommodating, was very inclusive, the union became a thorn in his side later on. He tried to crush it. Ben Ali, who came after him, tried to crush it. Neither man could crush it because it had such an important grassroots connection with the people of Tunisia that after the toppling of Ben Ali, the union played a key role in organizing protests leading up to the ouster, organizing people who continued to protest because after Ben Ali was gone, they protested for elections. Then they protested for the end of the Troika coalition government in 2013. The labor union led a coalition of 4 civil society organizations that saw Tunisia through its politically unstable time in 2013-2014. That in 2015 they were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. By contrast, so you have here a small army, a very effective labor union. In Egypt, you had a very strong army and you had a non-existent labor union. Until the 1950s, the labor union movement in Egypt paralleled that in Tunisia. But Jamal Abdel Nasser in 1957 crushed it. Okay, and there were a series of brutal oppressions of the union that ended up with the elimination of labor unions in Egypt and the creation of a replacement body called the Egyptian Trade ETUF, the Egyptian Trade Union Federation. And that became a tool of the state, so that its president is appointed by the president of the country, and the president of ETUF also serves as the Minister of Labor. So in the 31-year rule of Hosni Mubarak, ETUF stood with workers in their protests on one occasion, and one occasion only. Okay? And in the labor protests that led to the Arab Spring in Egypt, which were not dissimilar from the labor protests that brought about the downfall of Ben Ali in Tunisia, UGTT in Tunisia played a very key role in ensuring the success of that operation, and ETUF tried to work against it in the case of Egypt. So that's sort of the comparison between those two countries that had otherwise territorial legitimacy. And I would say that Tunisia and Egypt, in the Arab context, were the only 2 countries that were nations waiting to become states. There was a Tunisian nation in the 19th century. There was a Tunisian nation in the early 20th century. There were institutions that were put in place. Tunisians were educated by the French to fill civil servant positions. By the time the French left, the Tunisians were able to conduct their affairs, and to conduct their affairs very, very well. And there was a Tunisian identity. Okay. Elsewhere, if you look at the Levant, with the withdrawal of the Ottomans, there was nobody to take over administrative functions. 80% of the civil servants in the Ottoman Empire left for Turkey after the fall of the Ottoman Empire and the establishment of the Republic of Turkey in 1923. 80% of civil servants under the Ottoman Empire left for Turkey. So you had no institutions, you had borders that were thrown out of from nothing, you had regimes that either came into power by force or were installed by the colonial powers that insisted on a narrative, a national narrative and a national identity that was to a large extent fake and most definitely exclusive and exclusionary. And you start to understand sort of how all of that falls apart. Now, we didn't talk about Israel-Palestine, of course, and that's a huge, huge, huge factor. So with the 1948 establishment of the State of Israel and more than 700,000 Palestinian refugees who settled in Jordan, are absorbed in Jordan, in Syria and Lebanon where they are not, and then 1967 where you have the still ongoing occupation of the West Bank, and for a while the occupation of Gaza, and of course also the occupation of the Golan Heights. That of course added to the problems within those countries in terms of economic issues, demographic issues, tremendous affinity with the Palestinians for their suffering. But the Palestinian cause became largely used by Arab leaders, one, to distract their populations from internal problems, two, to justify their continuance in power, because they are speaking on behalf of the Palestinians, and their continuity thus is incredibly important. So the Palestinian cause has been exploited and used by Arab leadership throughout. The voices that spoke on behalf of Arab causes, primarily the Palestinian cause, came out of Damascus, Baghdad, and Cairo. Those were the three important capitals of the Arab world, the most powerful. You look at the map today, Baghdad is trying to reconstruct after the war. Damascus is hell on earth, right? And Cairo's gone. It does not have the influence it once had. It's now a puppet state of Saudi Arabia and relies on Saudi Arabia for its economic machinery, and Sisi would not be president if he was not propped up by Saudi Arabia. The centers of gravity in the region today are Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, Abu Dhabi in the Arab Emirates, and Doha in Qatar. Okay, so petrodollars are indicated. And then amongst those, of course, there's huge friction. So you have the blockade of Qatar, because Qatar has always also backed the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, backed the Muslim Brotherhood in the form of Hamas in Gaza. And Qatar always also punched above its weight. It's a small country, but has the world's largest gas reserves, has been sort of the thorn in the side of Saudi Arabia, the big brother, the 800-pound gorilla in the region in terms of its wealth and power, the reserve. And now you have new leadership in both the United Arab Emirates, well, actually in all three countries. Okay, in Qatar you have Tamim Prince Tamim, whose father abdicated for him a few years ago. But there has not been really a change in Qatar's policy, a detectable change in Qatar's policy. But in the UAE, with the death of Sheikh Zayed almost 20 years ago now, you have the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed, who is the Crown Prince, but who is the de facto ruler of the United Arab Emirates. And he has regional aspirations. The UAE has become more militarily involved than it ever was before. It's fighting a war in Yemen that has costed many of its soldiers. It's a very small country, the UAE. I mean, it's around 2 million inhabitants who are local. It's far greater because of expats. So you go to Dubai. Dubai is a city-state of around 3 million, 90% of whom are non-indigenous, okay, they're non-Emirati. So you have that in the UAE, and in Saudi Arabia you have MBS, like Mohammed bin Salman, who's the de facto crown prince. MBS and MBZ see themselves as sort of the new wave of leadership of the Arab world. MBS was hailed and welcomed by foreign capitals as the great reformer. People did not pay attention to the fact that one, he had rounded up more than 200 people at the Ritz-Carlton in Riyadh. The remaining detainees were released only a few weeks ago. That resulted in $100 billion being added to the coffers of the Saudi state, which means to his own coffers. The irony in it is that he rounded those people on the pretense of corruption. When Saudi Arabia, when you think about it, and you tell if I'm going too far, okay? When Saudi Arabia is structurally corrupt, it's a country named for its ruling family. It's a country where there is no distinction between private funds and public funds. MBS was rounding up those people at the same time that news started emerging about his purchase of a yacht from a Russian owner for $550 million, where he was using an interlocutor to buy him a supposedly Da Vinci painting for $500 million, and he had bought the world's most expensive mansion in France for $330 million. The roundup of those people at the Ritz-Carlton was really to consolidate his power, politically and economically. So it's not a coincidence that most of the princes who were detained belonged to the Abdullah and Nayef clans within the Al Saud royal family. Okay? He hijacked the prime minister of a sovereign country. Literally, he detained Saad al-Hariri, forced him to get on television and resign, until Emmanuel Macron flew to Riyadh and told him to release Saad al-Hariri. And then he claims he's a reformer, so now you have cinemas, you have musical concerts, women can drive. Okay. Sorry? Yeah, well, I'm gonna get there. But here's the problem. The world always looked at Saudi Arabia and said that look how backward they are and how horribly they treat their women. They don't even allow them to drive. So here's MBS saying, you want women to drive? I'll let that happen. You know, today robots can drive cars, right? So I let women drive. Never mind that during that period, in May alone of 2018, he rounded up 17 women activists, most of whom we have heard nothing from. Okay. Detained one who was in the UAE. Okay, and she was brought back to Riyadh, and she has not been heard from since. Okay, so a reform, first of all, is very superficial. Two, we created that incentive. You know, we kept saying let women drive, so he appeased the world public opinion, and the reform that is much more important, of course, is the deeper reform that has to deal with the religious establishment and how much it has affected the legal institutions and the educational systems. A woman in Saudi Arabia requires male guardianship, regardless of her age, to do almost anything. So if a woman wants to, now she can drive to the airport, but she can't get on a plane unless she has the written authorization of her male guardian. And her male guardian can be her father, can be her husband, it can also be a cousin, it can also be her son. Okay? Most legal transactions she cannot do without the written authorization of her male guardian. So big deal that she can drive. Okay? And then you have the Khashoggi affair. I have 5 minutes, okay. So I'll stop Khashoggi and then I'll wrap up. What can I tell you? I mean, it was, first of all, in the first 4 months of last year, January, February, March, April, there were 48 beheadings by the state in Saudi Arabia. Okay? Since MBS came into power, there have been 300 executions by the state, most of them beheadings, okay, in a period of 4 years. I mentioned the woman activist who was abducted in Abu Dhabi. There are 2 princes who were abducted from European and North American capitals and brought back to Saudi Arabia. Nobody has heard from them since. The brutality of the Jamal Khashoggi murder, abduction and murder is grotesque. It's not shocking. It's not shocking. I mean, this is not something that they have not done before, and it's something that they thought they can get away with unnoticed. The only problem here is that Jamal wrote for the Washington Post, and he was a resident of Virginia. Okay, so it immediately made him in the West one of us, and the Washington Post is not going to let go, and neither is the New York Times. And now with a democratic-controlled Congress, okay, the fight is going to keep on going. So you had in November, I think, the bill that was passed that is restricting now sales to Saudi Arabia of arms that are being used in Yemen. And now you have the whole thing with the sale of nuclear arms to Saudi Arabia that's being blocked by Congress. And you have also investigations that who's the winner in all of this? Turkey. Because for Turkey, the Khashoggi affair, the fact that it happened in its backyard, has given it exactly what it needed at the time that it needed it. You know, with the economic problems and the devaluation of its currency, the way it has been. First, it weakens MBS and it weakens Saudi Arabia, because don't forget, Turkey is on the side of Qatar. Because Qatar supported the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, just like it supports the AKP, which is the Islamist political party that is in power in Turkey. So Saudi Arabia was making Turkey's life difficult. Turkey has been using the Khashoggi affair, and the reason that we have not had everything released in terms of evidence, and it's been going out in tranches at the beginning, was to extract the price out of Saudi Arabia. So, to try to recap it all, the region, you know, one has to look at Syria as a humanitarian disaster, as a humanitarian disaster, but to understand it, you know, one has to really understand the regional politics that are taking place. MBS and MBZ, and by the way, there's another MBK, Mohammed bin Kushner. Okay, we didn't talk about the ultimate deal, that's Jared Kushner, President Trump's son-in-law, and this ultimate deal, maybe in the Q&A we can have a chance to talk about it. But MBS and MBZ are obsessed with Iran. And why are they obsessed with Iran? Leadership from within the region, within the Arab region, has not emerged since the days of Jamal Abdel Nasser. And Jamal Abdel Nasser led the Arabs into a devastatingly humiliating war in 1967, right? So you haven't had leadership emanate from there. MPS and MD, so leadership within the region, you know, you look at who are the great powers in the region. Israel, Turkey, and Iran. None of them Arab, okay? So for MPS, for MPZ, they, in their own minds, they see an opportunity to exert power and to flex their muscles, and they are obsessed with the power of Iran and what Iran poses as a threat to them. And that threat is not a nuclear threat. That's a threat of intellectual, economic, cultural, political dominance. The other thing is that Iran is Shiite. And Saudi Arabia's Islam, Sunni Islam, is predicated on Wahhabism. Muhammad Abdul Wahhab based his teachings on the words of Ibn Taymiyyah of the 13th century. Ibn Taymiyyah was a radical Muslim scholar. Muhammad Abdul Wahhab, his teachings basically are incredibly conservative. They were so radical that he was evicted by his own tribe from the village where he was. And in 1744, he met up with Saud, okay, the forefather of the Al Saud family, and they struck a union between the two. Because Muhammad Abdul Wahhab wanted to spread his version of Islam, and the Al Sauds were interested in spreading their dominance over the land of the Arabian Peninsula. In Abdul Wahhab, they found religious justification. Okay, so we're spreading Islam, and in them, in Al Saud, Abdul Wahhab found a means to spread. So when 1932 the country was founded, it was founded on Wahhabism, on the doctrine of Wahhabism, which is incredibly anti-Shiite, that considers Shiites to be heretics. So Iran has been fighting a proxy war with Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates in Syria. Russia, of course, which has great interests in Syria. One, Tartus, its naval port in Tartus is incredibly important. It is, the only opening it has on the Mediterranean Sea. It has an opportunity to exert its power and to extend its power under Putin as a global power. And the United States has basically subcontracted Syria to the Russians. So you have the Russians, you have the Turks also, who are very worried about the Kurds in the northern Syria, northern Iraq, forming an independent state. You've got Iran, and you've got those powers over there. And everybody then is stuck in the middle of all of this. And that competition, not with Iran, but between Egypt, Saudi Arabia on one hand, and Qatar on the other, has extended all the way to Libya. So in the midst of all of that, to me, Tunisia has offered sort of a semblance of hope, something that is working. And one of the reasons, by the way, it worked so well was because it was always small, insignificant, and far away. So nobody was interested in it. And that helped it preserve itself and go through the democratic transition it has been going through. Today, that it is a democracy, there is intervention in it. Because when the Islamist party in Nahda was in power, Qatar was backing it. When Nahda lost, the UAE started putting money into it. When the secular ruling party formed a coalition with the Islamists in Nahda, the UAE withdrew its money. For countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, having a successful democracy in the so-called Arab world is very threatening to them, because then their people demand the same things, and that's one of the reasons why Jordan was very limited in the reforms that it implemented as a result of the 2011 Arab Spring. The Saudis just would not allow it to. So listen, I know we've covered a lot of terrain. I don't know if that's all what you had in mind, but I think we'll open it up for some questions.
Yeah.